Hello, and welcome to another episode of Runners Roundtable, where in season 5, it's all about hot takes and talking about topics that I find interesting and I want to dive a little bit deeper on. And maybe we have uh, a stance or an opinion that not a lot of people have, or maybe people have and they have not been able to voice. So this episode is back to back marathons, and I am joined by Coach Kristyn Smith. And we're going to dive into all of that. But before we do, Kristyn, can you tell us about yourself, some of your running history? For those who have been listening to the podcast, she was on season 2, Conversations with Coaches. And I'll make sure to link to that episode so that you all can hear more from Kristyn after this episode. But yeah, let's start with you just reintroducing yourself to us and telling us a little bit of your, I guess, where are you with running right now?
Sure. Well, I live in New York City and I love marathons, but I do other races. One of the great things about living in New York City is we have every race distance, 100 times a year. So there's no shortage of things to try and races to participate in here. I'm very active in the local community. I coach people also remotely online all over the country, and I've coached people in a lot of different countries as well, as far away as Australia, United Arab Emirates, England, Ireland, so all kinds of different places. I just like to really coach people that are passionate about running and that have some kind of goal. It doesn't have to be a time goal at all. It can be um, you know, I want to improve and become more of a dedicated runner and fit it into my life as a mother, as a father, as a working professional, all of these kinds of things. So that's really what I'm passionate about, and that's who I like to work with.
I love that because I mean, I just remember when we talked on the season 2, which was Conversations with Coaches. I've already said that. But what I appreciated the most from that season was just learning how, even though we may have different approaches to how we coach, at the end of the day, we're all so committed to making running something that is possible for the people that we work with, regardless of where they are in life. That the run coach is someone who's going to work within the parameters of your life to make it possible. And I know you have been coaching, which I don't think, are you still coaching large groups of people as well?
No, not really. I was working with the club here in New York, and I switched clubs really because for my actually for my own running and training purposes, because I also have goals as a
Yeah.
runner, right? And so it's always this constant, balancing act, right? Of I want to, like I want to be the best version of myself. I want to maximize my potential. How can I do that? How can I enable that in that environment, right? And so I have really just been coaching online, and then the running that I do is with the club is for myself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's why I'm like, because I remember that just thinking,
Yes.
anytime I speak to any of you runners that are based out of New York City, I'm always in awe of just the running community there and how it seems like such a very richly layered community where you do get to see runners, your everyday runner to your sub elite runners to your elite runners. Like you just get, I feel like a good, I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say, but like just a good variety of runners and run clubs and whatnot there. So um I wanted to ask about that. So can we come to the topic of the back-to-back marathons, which is that's what we're talking about. I've done back-to-back marathons in early on in my running career when I say for me when I was young and dumb and I guess maybe last year I did the Chicago Marathon in the beginning of October and every women's marathon in the middle of November. So I don't know if that's technically considered a back-to-back marathon, but I guess that's where I wanted to start. In your mind, what what constitutes back-to-back marathons?
Well, the way I approach that concept as a coach is if you do not have a separate dedicated training cycle with the
Mm.
recovery after, then we are back to backing. Um, Obviously, there's some variations because I've done a back to back. I've done the London Boston combo 2 times, and that is 7 days apart. And that is, of course, vastly different than I've done a Berlin and a New York, which are more like 6 weeks apart. And so, those are different, require different things, different demands on the body, but those are still both back to back in my book. If you have the ability to do a full training cycle with recovery, I really like recovery post marathon to be minimum 3 weeks. And you have that block in between each, then it's not a back-to-back marathon. I like to bring this up because I have people do this where they only think about back-to-back between spring and fall. But if you
Mhm.
have a very late fall, say you do a CIM and then you do a very early spring, you can still end up with back-to-back. It's like I'm pacing Tokyo, which is going to occur in 3 weeks, right? So that's a very early, that's a March, um, first weekend in March race, right? If you did a CIM, those two in between it's there's not time for a full recovery and a full training cycle between,
Love
right?
that.
So even though it's from one year to the next, 2024 to 2025, a lot of people are not calculating those weeks in their brain and they're going, well, those are two totally separate races. And she's like, no, it's still very close together. So that counts as back to back. But again, that's my definition.
Okay, so that to me is like hot take number one here, right? Because as you're speaking, my eyes are going, yes, like I absolutely love that definition because coming, even just me, even me, hello, fellow run coach here, coming into this conversation, my brain was very much so fixated on back-to-back marathons are close in proximity. Whereas what you're saying is absolutely true, right? If you don't get that full recovery period and then rebuild all over again, you're using what you did in one marathon. That's your foundation as you continue training. There is no break, there is no building phase, there is really no yeah, I just want to say I absolutely love that definition because it invites us to hopefully think a little bit harder about the importance of recovery when we're looking at what are we doing in these back-to-back races and what is the timeline of these back-to-back races. So I mean I wrote it down. I'm like different training blocks, but you have to have that full recovery period between the training blocks in order for them to be considered two different training points. Because, yeah, a lot of people would say, oh, I ran CIM, then I can take a couple of weeks off and then I'm jumping into another one. But it's like, how many weeks off are you actually giving yourself before not only physically jumping back into training, but also mentally? Like, what is the mental recovery? And I think that's something that in general we don't talk about enough. And I'm curious, as someone who is, and you've done back to back marathons, so spoiler alert, you've said it too. What are some of the mental things that we should keep in mind when it comes to these back to back marathons, or maybe even thinking about doing back to back marathons? Because I know, especially with the increasing popularity of the marathon majors, I feel like more and more people are starting to do back to back marathons. I don't know if it's the smartest or the safest thing for a lot of people to do, and I want to pick your brain on that. But before I get there, I'm just curious from your experience, some of the mental things that you're going through as you do back to back marathons, or what are some of the considerations for that?
Well, so I have a great example of this. 2021, I did 3 marathons, all 3 majors. I did London, Boston, and then New York City, all 3 marathons within 35 days. And all three in different locations. So I have a very distinct memory of starting New York City Marathon. This is my hometown race, right? I love this race. But I started the race and I wasn't 10 miles in and I was like I was over it. I was like I know where home is from here. Like, can I just go home right now? And I'm literally in the middle of the world's greatest marathon, right? Because mentally I had just gone through so many different things. And the other thing too, particularly with these giant marathons where the logistics and everything that's involved with it is a production, right? All of that is sapping your energy, right? So, like, just going to the expo is not a simple get in and get out, even if you want it to be, right? And it's like 10,000 steps just to get from, through the expo, get your bib, blah, 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 get to, transportation to race morning for these point to point courses, right? And all of that is sapping, draining out of you, right? There's also some benefits in that. There is an energy boost, right, from the crowds and the hype and all of that stuff. But keep in mind, by the time you've done it for the second or the third time, it just starts to blend together in one
Mhm.
kind of like it doesn't it's not as exciting anymore, right? Think about it as like an analogy. Like if it was your birthday party, every single day and every single day you had a birthday cake, by the 10th day, by the fifth day, you wouldn't want the birthday cake anymore, right? It's like it becomes regular. So for me, I like to caution people and say, hey, you're kind of cheating yourself out of the experience. These are huge, grand, exciting things. And when you just slam them in, one, two, three, four, bang, 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 you can't fully relish and celebrate that experience because you're just jumping from one to the next, checking off the list, right? And keep going. So, that doesn't mean don't do it ever. It just means that keep that in mind when you're doing this.
I'm so glad I asked that question because I've had that conversation with someone recently about Berlin and New York City, right? Because oftentimes you'll get people, and this has been in my experience, not only with myself, but also just working with runners, where they'll be like, "Oh, but the first race, that's my goal race, and I'll do the marathon for fun." And I'm like, "There's no doing a marathon for fun. Like it's going to take a toll. Even if you have a great time while you're out there, it's not like a traditional type of fun because of everything that you just said, that it's the toll of travel, which people underestimate how stressful travel is and how much that can impact your emotional state, how that impacts your nervous system, like going to an airport, if there's delays, if your flight's not on time, if you lose your luggage, like all of those are things that do take a toll. So even if your first marathon is your goal race, and then the second one, you're like, I'm just going to do it for fun. It's exactly what you said. It's whether you're traveling to the race, whether you're having to go to expo. And if we're talking about marathon majors here, you're having to do that with anywhere between, 30 to 50,000 other people, right? So it's not like, I guess for me, it's always just the difference of like, oh, back to back 5Ks. Okay, your local 5K, at least here in Miami, your local 5K is 500 people. So you can do it. Yes, the distance is shorter. But these marathon majors, you're talking about, let's assume you do something like Berlin and New York City, right? You've got two of the biggest ones. So I think last year it was like 53 at Berlin and then 54, 55 in New York City. So it's like you're going to these very, very, very busy races with a lot of other people, and that does wear on you. So I'm so glad I asked that question and that you highlighted those things, because I feel like people often just think, oh, it's they don't see beyond race day to understand that there's a whole experience that comes with it. So mental side is really important. Do you find that it's different if you have more space between the races? are you able to savor, and I guess in your personal experience, if the races are further apart from each other, even though they're back to back, that you are able to savor each race as its own individual experience?
It does help. I do think that your motivation and what you're trying to get out of the race needs to be really well defined, right? Um, a lot of people are motivated by times and time goals. Even if we like to say, "Oh, well, I just want to have fun."
Mhm.
Really, true story. In the back of your mind, you do have almost everybody will have some number they want, right? Um, and so it's a question of how motivating is that? Are you willing to compromise on it if things start going wrong, right? And then the other thing too is from the training aspect, when you do these back to back, you are going to be in almost a constant state of training. So that is something that I think people don't fully grasp when they're signing up for, number five, number six, like the year becomes completely crammed. There's no ability to actually do other things. Like imagine if you just had a Saturday night or, Saturday morning or Friday night where you weren't, stressed out about getting up and running for 2 hours or 3 hours, right? It is a good thing to take breaks and to be able to step away from the sport, even as much as you love it. And I love it as much as anybody, but it's good to be able to take some times throughout the year where you can step away from it or step back from it and do other things, even if that other thing is like little home projects or whatever it is. Spend more time with your kids. Just other things, because then when you come back to the sport, you have just that much renewed energy and excitement for what you have ahead. It's really hard to 365 days a year after year, keep your motivation high and strong to just like train, 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 train.
Yeah, I had my own back-to-back experience, right? And this was last year. I hadn't done that since maybe 2015. 2015 was a wild year for me. Okay, 2015 I ran the Miami Marathon. I mean, I was back to back to your point. So I ran the Miami Marathon, I believe, in February. March/April, I ran a 50K. Then in September of that year, I ran Berlin. And October, 2 weeks later, I ran the Chicago Marathon. I look back at that year. I have no clue how I did it. Again, I say it's because I was young and dumb, and recovery was really like the recovery was so I was just elastic. I think I was like a little baby who falls and then they bounce back up and they're okay. I think that's what my body did that year. So last year, going into that back to back situation, having now I'm in an older, more weathered, wonderfully weathered body. My concern very much so was, am I going to be recovered enough to be able to do that? And even then, I took the front half of the year very easy. I did my usual, and easy for me is I did my usual half marathons, the local ones that I like to do, did that, but no other big or longer distances up until summer training started. And even then, I went into that knowing that Chicago was my goal race, and not so much goal by time, but that was the race that really mattered to me. And whether or not I continued to do every woman's marathon like that one, I wanted to do it. And then I got to a point where I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this for other reasons. I ended up doing the race. I was really proud of myself for being able to do that. But let me tell you, I was so relieved to not have to look at another marathon distance in the face for a year. because I am signed up to do this year's Chicago. But it was one of those things where I was honestly questioning my sanity of like, why am I doing this? I I have a love-hate relationship with the marathon distance where I love the race aspect of it, the training for it, particularly because I'm here in Miami, Florida, and heat, humidity is something that I will never grow resilient to. I will survive, but I will not thrive in those conditions. And it just marathon training for me is really, really hard. So I'm always dumbfounded as to why I continue to run marathons and like why I show up to the distance. And I've decided that it's because I get completely inspired by running these races, knowing that every single person with me is doing the same thing, and we're all digging deep for that 26.2 finish line. I think that's what keeps me coming back to the distance, just our capacity to achieve great things. But even still, it's like, why would anyone want to do a back to back? Like I did it and I've done it before. And I'm like, why? Like, why did I think this was a good idea? And I mean, to this day, I don't have an answer to that other than the community of people at those races is what makes it possible or makes it desirable to do. So I think looking to yourself, I'm still trying to figure out that answer. Do you have an answer to that of like why? Why would you do back-to-back marathons? Like what? Yeah, just why?
Well, I there's definitely a subset of people like the marathon maniacs where they are that is sort of their claim to fame, and that is a drive that in and of itself is a main driver, right? How many can you collect and in how short a time frame and all of that. And then there's also those that are motivated by like the 50 states club, right, where they're trying to like knock it out in as quick a time frame as possible, right? And 50, that's a big number. So in order to do that, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4 weekend, get as many as you can. Um, then there's someone like me. I fall into the same category that you do, I think, where when I was younger and when I was sort of starting out more, I was felt invincible, right? And I had goals, right? But I could just kind of bounce around more. They were sort of more easily achieved. When you're a beginner runner, like every time at the distance is an automatic PR. You didn't have to you didn't have to really
Yeah.
work for it, right? And so that I just sort of fell into that. I won some lottery spots, I got lucky here, there, and so I just like piled them on. But as I've gotten older, things become harder. It becomes, like you have to work more to get the same out of it, right? And so I've really tried to stay away from that more, the back to back. And also because I've done 22 marathons now and I'm like I I understand this race. I understand the distance. I don't feel that I need to continue to, have a 4 marathon year or um uh, because I've changed focus in that I would like to have longevity in the sport. This is my new aim. um I'm a master's runner now. I'm pushing 43. So my new aim is to I want to try to be in this sport for as long as possible. And that means not getting burnt out on it, right? And so that has become my new focus. But again, like years ago, I was like, oh, I can just throw these out one, and no harm, no foul, just keep it right going. But that does tend to change after a while.
Yeah, I think that's why when I was younger I did more races, and now the older I've gotten, I'm a little choosier with the races because of that longevity piece and because I find that I spend a lot more time thinking about how my body is feeling in training cycles now. Whereas before I would just do them and be like, if something comes up, whatever. Now it's kind of like, okay, How did I feel this week? Mileage went up. Am I okay? Am I recovering? Like I'm asking more questions of myself because of that longevity piece, because my brain has shifted into, do you really need to be running? And this is me in that time of running all those races. It's like, do you really need to be running, 50 to 55 miles a week? And now with everything else that I have going on in life, it's like, no, I don't have the time for that, especially because I am getting older and I do need to start prioritizing things like strength training. And in order for me to do the strength training with the running has to give some to make up time because I just cannot do it all. So that longevity piece, I think, is really, really, really important. And I think important question for people to ask themselves as they're looking at race schedules, as they're looking at how things are panning out in terms of, does this configuration of races, does it help me be in this sport for longer? Or is it something that honestly, and I guess I have this question for you. What worries you more, injury or burnout?
Well, everybody's going to hate me when I say this, but I have only had one real injury in my whole running career. I should knock a lot of wood right now. I am extraordinarily fortunate, right? I have coached runners that will are injured at the drop of a hat, running like a fraction of the mileage I'm doing and doing everything right, right? So it's not necessarily something that I picked or they did wrong or whatever, but I am extraordinarily lucky in that I have been very resistant and resilient, health wise. So for me personally, my kind of thing to watch out for is the burnout because I have very easily gone too far. I'm trying to push the envelope, right? And so I normally it's the brain that for me, has given out before the body. But we're all different and we all have different strengths and weaknesses, right? So for other people, it might be the body that's the first thing that says, "Hey, wait a minute, we got to slow down," right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in that boat with you in that I've only had one major injury. Anything else have been like these little like nagging pains that because I'm so concerned about longevity, I've become a very, I think, hyper cautious person now that if anything, if I start to feel anything, I'm like, we back off. We back off. It's okay. It's okay. Like I have been known to take a week off of running just because I'm like, you know what? My body is telling me, my body is communicating quietly that it needs me to back off and rest. So I'm going to listen to that because taking a week off or pulling back on workouts is so much more preferable than continuing on and then having to take 6 weeks off, 2 months off, or whatever the case is. So I'm with you in that. And that's, I think, part of why I wanted to ask because I'm like, the issues I've dealt with have been more mental with burnout. And it's, I've had it happen to me where running starts to feel like a chore and I no longer have the joy for running. So then my motivation, I guess I will always have the dedication. I will get it done because I am dedicated to it. But I will do it very grumpily. Like my motivation to do it will not come from a place of joy. It'll come from that place of it being a chore. And that to me, I worry more about that headspace than anything else. But to what you're saying and what I've said as well, it's perhaps that is a privilege of not having any major injuries that sidelines the process. So that's why I asked because I find that people don't think about that as well of what's the mental dedication that you need to give in order to do back-to-back races of any distance, of any, especially if you're going back to back looking to PR. or looking to hit very specific time goals in each race. So, yeah, I want to kind of come back to something that we've touched upon, but not really, or not with clarity. So, someone, for whoever's listening to this episode and they're thinking about doing back to back marathons, what are some of the questions you would want them, or some of the things you would want them to consider when making the choice to either do back to back marathons or perhaps shift things around, maybe defer a race, maybe, and I say defer in terms of people who get into like enter various lotteries and then they get in. What's some of the things that people should be thinking about when they are considering doing back to back marathons?
Well, there's a trade-off for everything, right? And so we all need to realize that. Um, a lot of times we want to have it all, right? And it's just not reality. So, particularly if you are a person with performance goals and you are performance minded and you have time things that you want to attach to these races, then you need to strongly consider how a back to back is going to affect that, because it's it's very easy to say, oh, well, I'll just take this easy, and and in your brain go, nothing will happen. It'll just be, I like the ones where it's like, they want to gamble with like doing the first race as a quote long run, and then and then have the time goal for the second one, and it's like that's a lot of just putting it out into the world and hoping, crossing your fingers and hoping that everything goes well. Because in all of the 22 marathons that I've done, I've never come off any marathon the same, right? Some I've bounced back really quickly, some I've not, and there's only so many things that you can control. Sometimes the weather is a huge factor on race date. This year we had I did the Boston and London double this April 2024, and Boston was so hot and it was such a rough day. That was my sixth time running Boston, and I felt this Boston more than any other because it was 70 degrees, right? But I couldn't train for that, right? Like there was no way for me to go, oh, well, Boston's going to be 70, so I will prepare in this way.
Yeah.
So there's a certain number of factors that are out of our control, and you can only manage and deal with the things that you have the ability that are within your power. So keep that in mind again when you're trying to line everything up and make everything go perfectly. You mentioned that also with travel and all of the, I mean, geez, the number of delays that occur just between getting from point A to point B. These are all things, again, it's like it's beyond you. So you have to think about all of these things. You have to prepare for the worst almost and just
Mm-hmm.
hope that it goes better.
Yeah. And I want to just, for clarification's sake, or in your opinion, if someone is doing back to back marathons and they do have a performance goal, which race should they prioritize when it comes to that goal? The
Well,
first or the second?
yeah, generally the first.
Okay.
And the reason I understand the reasons that people, because the first one will be a harder course, say, right? And then the second one will be their easier course or their local race, the race they know better, things like that. So there are reasons that people do that. But again, it's you in that instance, you're really counting on how you are going to recover from the first race. And it's very little in terms of what your actual training has been, right? Whereas when you go into the first one, you can engineer it a little bit more, right? So that's just something, it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I think I want to also just point out something that you mentioned before, that your typical recovery time after a marathon is 4 weeks. And I find for me, it's definitely 4 to 6 weeks after a marathon is once I start to feel like my normal self. Like I feel like I have my spring, like the spring back in my step. So I know, for instance, last year when I did every woman's marathon, I knew that I guess what I knew is that I really didn't know how my body was going to respond to the race and to being in that distance. I could take the things that I learned in Chicago, about fueling and carb loading and how to prepare in the lead up to the race. But to what you're saying, I had no clue how my body was going to feel after Chicago or how quickly I was going to come back. So even though physically I had 26.2 miles in my body, I had done it, I also didn't know if which used to happen to me, thankfully it has not happened to me, knock on wood as well, is that after big races, I would get sick and that would delay my recovery period. And we're talking about something you cannot control, right? Like you can't control going to a big race where there's a lot of people doing a marathon that is breaking down your muscles, breaking down everything that you can. And then after the race, traveling on an airplane or wherever it is, again, surrounded by a lot of people that you don't know what they've got. And in the past, that was something that always delayed my recovery because I would get sick and just my recovery needs were so much greater than if I hadn't gotten sick. But this time I didn't get sick and I was surprised. I was like, all right, I didn't get sick. Like I thought something was wrong with me. I'm like, what's wrong? And same thing after every woman's, I didn't get sick. I was really, really, really proud of that. But I just, for me, as I said, Chicago was my priority because it was the first race, because to what you're saying, there is more that I could control in that lead up. Whereas that 5 weeks between the two races, 5, 6 weeks, um, I didn't know how my body was going to be. I didn't know how my body was going to feel. I didn't know mentally how I was going to feel. Like, was I going to feel finishing Chicago? Was I going to be like, yes, this is awesome. Let's do it again? Or was I going to be like, what the heck did I get myself into? How am I supposed to do this all over again? And those are things that I think makes it difficult for people to really understand when maybe what you're seeing on something like social media is a highlight reel of it. And I was really aware of that for myself of like, how much do I want to share of these two experiences? Because I don't want people to think that because I did it, everyone should do it. And I don't know if you've had, I guess, with athletes that have come your way, has that been something that comes up?
Um, yeah, I do kind of come off like a bit of a hypocrite because I'm like, don't do it, but then I go and do it, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, so again, this year, 2024, I did the Boston London double for the second time, mind you, and I said after I did it, I am not doing this again. Cut to this spring, I am doing Tokyo and Boston double in the spring. And again, I'm like, the reason I will, little asterisks for this to say that I'm a pacer for Tokyo. I have no, like, it really legitimately will be an easy run. And I've run Boston, this will be my seventh Boston, right? So I know the race. I'm not like, I know what I'm getting myself into, but again, I don't generally recommend it, even though I am going and doing exactly what I'm saying. Um, I, I do think there's a way to balance it out. And I do think so. My overall goal is I am now going to not do a fall marathon because I
Mhm.
have set myself up this way in the spring, right? So I'm trying to overall balance the year because my spring is lopsided in this way, right? And so, I think there is a way to make it work and to sort of make different scenarios fit for the individual, but you may need help or you may need to look into the much bigger picture to make sense of it and to make it work in a way that doesn't burn you out, that doesn't lead to injury, that doesn't lead to plateauing or overtraining and fatigue and all of these things, right? Um, so, you there may be a need to like really zoom out and say, okay, I'm going to go really hard for these couple of months, but that means the counter to that is it is very easy for several other months on the other side, And so that's the way personally I do it, and I encourage the runners that I'm coaching personally. When I do have a say in the racing schedule, I say, okay, we can do these things but it's a give and the take, right? That's it. Give and the take and trade-offs.
Yeah, it's funny because I was going to ask you, how do we train for back-to-back marathons? And now I'm not going to ask that because it is just based off of what you said, right? It is such a personalized experience that requires a zoomed out view of things. And it's not to say that, listen, people, I'm not saying you need to get a coach if you're doing this. I'm just encouraging you very, very strongly to get a coach because of those things of fatigue, of burnout, of overtraining, which I feel can be really, really, really easy to do, especially when you're looking at that period between marathons where you might think, oh, I need to keep up the intensity and do all the stuff. And it's like, uh, probably need to pull back some, maybe not completely because time may not allow for you to completely stop doing everything. But I think it requires a little more guidance and even an outside perspective to tell you, let's look beyond these two races and let's look beyond the desire to do these races. I know oftentimes the conversation I have with athletes are very much so centered on what do you have going on in life? Like, are we entering a busy season of work? Because if we are, back-to-back races is not the best idea. Obviously, you can do what you want to do, but I find that when you have a coach or you have someone that is asking those questions, it at least plants a seed of thoughtfulness that may not have existed there. So we're not going to answer that question of how do you train for these things because there is no one size fits all to it. And I don't think there should be a one size fits all to it, especially when, to something you said earlier, there's a difference between training for, say, Berlin and Chicago, which time frame is shorter, but they're also relatively flat courses. And then training for Berlin in New York, where it's, yes, longer period of time, but very, very different courses and also very different logistics to even starting the race. So there is no, again, no one size fits all of like, if you want to run two races, do this when it's like, okay, but it actually, I feel like that requires even more planning of understanding what are you going to need to do in order to accomplish those two races if you're doing two races that are significantly different from each other, because 26.2 miles downhill is really, really different than 26.2 miles with hills and lots of changes in elevation. So for someone who's listening to this, I guess what would you say is the most important thing that they should keep in mind when thinking about doing back-to-back marathons?
Other than the initial planning and really big zoomed out view in terms of the year and balancing, um, really concentrating on the in between. And I would like to really always stress less is more, less is more. less is more. Because a lot of times I have runners, they only think about their legs and how sore they are. And they go, "Oh, coach, on day 2 or day 3, oh, my legs aren't sore. So that means I'm just fine. Everything's the same." Not the case at all. Um, there are other things occurring. You do not necessarily feel it initially. But one of the to your point, I know this very well. That springiness, that sharpness, that quick turnover, the bounciness in your step, that is a sure sign of how fatigued you are or not. Other things like your resting heart rate, or when you go out for the easy run, what is your heart rate compared to what it was before the marathon? Because all of these things will be raised and higher, and people aren't looking at that. They're just going, "Well, my legs aren't sore, so I'm recovered," and that is not a complete assessment, right? So trying to jump back in, or trying to, especially trying to force a lot of speed when your body isn't ready for it, this is a huge red flag and should be avoided, right? So that when I was going back in the very beginning and I said it's a back-to-back marathon, if you do not have a training cycle to train in between, if there are not sufficient weeks in between, there is no more training cycle, right? You're going to get one training cycle for 2 races. So
Mm.
consider it like that. Build it like that. It's not, I'm doing this one race and then I'm going to train and do all of this fitness and all this speed and get everything back, immediately in between and go right back into it. You're not. Physically, you're not able to do that. So do not plan it that way.
Yeah, that's such a great point because I find this topic so fascinating, and much to what you said earlier, where I feel like such a hypocrite because I'm like, I don't recommend it, but I just did it. But I think what you're saying, or one of the things that I want to emphasize from what you said is that yes, it's one training cycle for 2 races, but holy smokes, do we need to put more attention to that recovery period between the races? And it's beyond the, oh, my legs are no longer sore. Listen, I've done it. I've done marathons before. And it's like on day 5, I'm like, my legs aren't sore. I'm good. Let me go run. And then I go run and I feel like I have cement for legs. So just because I'm walking around and able to sit on a toilet and like climb stairs, right, doesn't mean that once I start putting the force and the pounding on my body, I'm not going to feel it. So it's almost like, okay, if you're going to do these back to back marathons, I hope you have a really, really, really solid plan for recovery. And it's not just the recovery where you're not running. I'm talking about the recovery where you're feeding yourself well, where you're stretching, maybe where you're doing your mobility work or you're getting like body work via massages done, but that you are taking all that time that you would be running to just love on your body and to give it everything it needs to recover. So it's like, and you said it before, right? Like, I feel like this, an underlying theme to this is the importance of recovery and being really intentional with recovering well in order to do that. And even as I was listening to you speak and you're talking about this one build for both races, it's like, again, if that's what you're going to do, then you need to really take your recovery periods, your recovery time, and your training cycle. You've got to take it seriously. Like, none of this active recovery bullshit where you're like, oh, I have a day off, but I'm going to go, do a heated power yoga class and then walk for 5 miles. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about like, yeah, like, that recovery day or that rest day, let it be a true rest day where you're, man, I don't know, meal planning the most delicious, like meal prepping the most delicious, nourishing meals you can for yourself as you train. So that to me is something that in listening to you speak, you kept coming back to that, how important recovery is. And honestly, we all myself included, I know, don't optimize. I will optimize the running part, but not the resting part. So I think that's something that's really I'm taking that with me of recovery. And again, just looking back to my last back-to-back situation where there was so much stress and I definitely did not rest and I definitely did not recover as much as I feel like I should have. I still had what I oh yes, my gosh, I'm so glad I'm saying this because you mentioned it that even if you say you're going to take a run easy, I'm here to tell you that's a lie. That is a lie because there is always a time goal, even if your time goal is easy. And I say that because when I did Every Woman's Marathon, that was supposed to be my fun run, like the easy one. I still had a time that I wanted to do that race in. And it wasn't because I was trying to PR, it wasn't any of that. It was because I needed to time my nutrition. I needed to know how many gels, how many gummies to have on me. So there was no fun and easy about it when I still had to approach that race with those practical considerations of how much fuel do I need in order not to die on this race. So I also wanted to say that because you said it and I was like, she's right. There is no taking it easy. None of that. None of that. When you still have to train in a way and you still have to run in a way that is going to allow you to finish. And it's not just what your body is doing and how it's moving. It's also like, what does your body need in order to keep that movement going? So, oh, wow. Okay. This was, I feel like a lot. Is there anything else? Like, is there anything else you wanted to talk about when it comes to these back-to-back marathons?
Well, one thing I do like to say, because I have coached a lot of people for this, and at the outset, the better you can make your training, the more high quality it can be. And that means in terms of the recovery as well, not overlooking that. But uh, the more focused uh, that can be in the lead in, the better off you're going to come off that first race, right? And the better
Mhm.
you are able to come off that first race and execute that first race, the more quickly you are able to bounce back and get to the next one, right? So if you are thinking about doing this and you're sort of on the fence about it, do know that you don't want to shortchange yourself. And really, what I say to people is you're training more for like an ultra than you are training for a single 26.2, right? So keep that in mind. If I know that I'm coaching somebody for double marathons, I am really not going like short on the volume. I'm really not going short on the 20 milers. I will, when I can, have them run the day after the long uh, run, the very
Mhm.
following day, right? So we're teaching the body to run, like it's a 20 miler on one day and then a 3 to 6 miler on the next day. And so the body knows how to continue moving when it really doesn't want to move, right? And so this is how you can better enable this to happen. But really, it's about, recovering as best as possible from the first one, and then giving everything that you need to get to the second one. And like I said, less is more in the in between, generally speaking.
Yeah, and you just brought up something so important. I wrote it down again. I'm like writing all these little nuggets down. And I think this is again where the coach comes in handy. um, is the timing of what you're doing. So I just wrote down that if you're doing a double in the fall, so let's assume it's 2025, right? And your intention is to double up in the fall, then what you do now in the winter and what you do in the spring is going to set a really, really strong foundation for you for when training starts in the summer. So that's that whole what you were saying about zooming out and looking at everything as a whole. To me, it's the double races. After hearing you speak, it's not just the season of the races, the training, but it's how are you prepping yourself beforehand so that when you do get into that intensity of essentially training for an ultra marathon, your foundation is really, really solid. Whether it be a foundation in your running days and in the routine, or even maybe more importantly, the foundation you have with being committed to your recovery times and your rest periods, because it's all important. So I wrote that down where I'm like, okay, people, if you're looking at doing something in the fall, you need to start implementing things now so that when you get there, you don't have to worry about burning out, or you don't have to worry about injuring yourself or any of those other things that would make doing a double challenging. So, oh my gosh, so many great nuggets. Just thank you. I have a few more questions. They're really just all about you. Can you remind us and tell us where can we find you and how can we better connect with you?
I have a website. I'm also in the VDOT marketplace. So I am a VDOT certified coach, and I that's where I live. So you can find me there. But my website is Coach Chris RS. Now I'm going to spell this because you could spell it 100 different ways. Coach, we know. Chris, KRISRS.com. So that's where you can find me. I love to have new runners, old runners, in between runners, any runners of any level really. Um, a lot of times people they'll read my bio and they think that I only coach people that are exactly like me. Like you have to be a woman and you have to be a marathoner and you have to be all of these things, and that's not the case at all. So really anybody, as long as you have passion for running and a desire to do great things, I'm for you.
Aside from this Tokyo Boston double that you're doing, what else is on the docket for 2025 that you're really excited about?
I I have big goals for the fall, which, as I mentioned, I will not be doing a marathon this fall. And that's kind of unheard of for me because I said, I've said it 100 times. I love marathons. Like I'm addicted to marathons. But I am doing myself the favor of stepping away from the distance for a little bit. I'm going to actually do a mile race. I've never done just a mile race. And I'm going to target some 5Ks and 10Ks, which I mean, I've done dozens of them, right? But I've
Yep.
never targeted it. So this is what I'm looking forward to this fall, which, I'm going to, teach this old dog some new tricks.
Yeah. And I think you are living it because I know oftentimes after I have athletes have done a big marathon build, I try to encourage them to do something like a 5K or a 10K because I'm like, hey man, that's totally different systems and it's going to be shorter. It's going to be fun because it's shorter. You're not out there for 3 hours, right? Like it's such a different approach. And I think when it comes to that longevity piece that we spoke to earlier, I think that's also a way of keeping you engaged in the sport because you're switching things up for yourself and you are teaching yourself how to how to be different even though you're still you because yeah, I always say it, a 5K to me is just as intimidating as a marathon when that's your goal. Like when your goal is to race that, there's yeah, 5Ks to me are scary. So I'm excited. I'm excited for you to do that. All right, final question is just what are your final words for us today?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I hope everybody has learned something. And I don't want it to come across that there's only one way to do things, or you must, how dare you enjoy this other thing that we aren't recommending. I think there really is a time and a place for everything. And almost anything under the sun, we can accommodate, we can make it a joyful, enriching experience, right? It's just in the nitty gritty of the details of how do we make that, right? And so it really just comes from being thoughtful and not really taking everything for granted, or not saying I'm going to apply this one model to 100 different scenarios, or my friend did this and so I'll just copy that exactly and it'll work perfectly for me, right? So we really can make any kind of thing or any arrangement, good and rewarding. But we just have to manipulate the things that we can to do that, right? So it takes a little bit of a thoughtful approach, but anything can be achievable, and a learning experience, which is, I think a very valuable thing in this, well, for anybody.
Absolutely. Kristen, thank you so much for joining me today and for opening my eyes to back-to-back marathons and some of the things that we should keep in mind or consider. And to what you're saying is bring that same like just mindfulness and awareness to those goals. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.